Remember when I used to make content about the Powerpuff Girls? Yeah, me neither. I mean, it was only like a year ago, but you get the point. In all seriousness though, I really can't help but feel like I've been far too neglectful of the Powerpuff Girls for most of this year. And given that we're talking about one of the objectively best cartoons ever created, it would simply be a disservice not to have at least one video dedicated to it. So, I'm gonna be rectifying that in the best way possible. Talking about fanfiction. Whether you love it or hate it, I think it's universally agreed that fanfiction tends to be one of the most controversial and volatile aspects of any fandom. In my experience, they're either surprisingly well-written thrillers that take advantage of their freedom from the shackles of corporate to deliver something truly great, or poorly executed atrocities that make me eternally grateful fans aren't the ones writing for some of my favorite IPs. And there is very little in between. For better or worse, the Powerpuff Girls is no exception to this rule. I've read my own fair share of cliché tropes manufactured for drama, stereotypical puff and rough shipping. Seriously, why do people want to ship them so bad? And no, I actually think that about covers it. I mean, I guess I could also count this one story I read that's just in a whole league of its own. It's this fanfic called Diary of Buttercup, where the basic premise is that Blossom and Bubbles like to physically torture Buttercup. There was no reason for it, by the way. They just did it because it brought them joy, I guess. But then Buttercup starts dating Butch, and then she goes to live with the Rowdy Rough Boys, and so everything is resolved, and they live happily ever after, because all Buttercup needed was a man, I guess. It was a read. Yeah, a read is what it was. On the other hand, I've also read a lot of genuinely great Powerpuff Girls fanfiction, like the entire villain saga, which I unfortunately can't talk about in this video because then it would be like 3 hours long. And, of course, basically everything created by writer Parsec Productions. Those into the horror genre may recognize the name Parsec from the game series Slender: The 8 Pages. And that's because, well, they're the same person. Yes, before his work on the infamous creepypasta series that would ultimately serve as his rise to fame, Parsec, also known as Mark J. Hadley, was most known for his massive catalog of stories dedicated to the Powerpuff Girls. That's not to say that he didn't dip his toes into other fandoms from time to time. Coincidentally, given my interests, he also wrote a fic for Sonic the Hedgehog starring my second favorite character, Amy Rose. Though there are only ever 2 chapters posted, and it currently remains unfinished. Even with these other fandoms, the Powerpuff Girls was by far the most popular show for Parsec to write about. And as you can imagine, the first story he ever posted on fanfiction.net was a PBG fanfic titled The Antibbuff Girls, where Mojo Jojo decides to reenact his Rowdy Rough Boy scheme, this time keeping the original recipe intact and only swapping out the chemical X for its infamous antidote. The story itself is fine. The prose can get a little clunky at points, and the plot itself is fairly straightforward and doesn't do a lot to shake up the typical evil PBG formula. But for a first attempt, I would say it's pretty decent, and it did end up being the stepping stone for some genuinely amazing fics later on. Now, I don't have time to go over every single fanfic that Parsec has ever written for the Powerpuff Girls. I mean, I kinda do, but it would take, like, months for me to release it, and the video would, again, be 3 hours long. So I decided to choose 4 highlights to focus on in this video. Not only are these some of my favorite stories from this author, but they also serve as the best showcases for what Parsec has to offer in his, well, I guess you could call it a fanfic writing career, except you can't get paid for writing fanfics, for obvious reasons. First up on the list, we've got Nothing Ventured, Nothing Trained. This story is centered around the Utonium residents and their world-renowned training room. You know, the one that turned Bubbles into a menace. God, I love that episode. Professor Utonium decides to give his training system a test run after implementing some suggestions given by the girls themselves. Everything seems fine at first, but an unexpected lightning strike at Townsville's power plant leads to an energy surge throughout the entire city's electrical systems, including the one that powers the training room battery. What starts out as a malfunctioning system that can't be shut off through normal means gradually morphs into a system with an entire mind of its own, creating and creating additional levels that were never built into its programming until it eventually overloads itself through a self-inflicted weakness in its unstable generation of monsters. I feel like there's some sort of metaphor in all this, but I'm not clever enough to figure out what it is. If there's one thing I will give this story, it's a pretty solid starting point into the Parasect Powerpuff fanfic verse. In terms of length, it only clocks in at one chapter and a little under 9,000 words, so it's a fairly short read. While the story isn't quite as tightly structured and well executed as some of the author's later works, it's nonetheless built on an interesting concept that lends itself to an enjoyable narrative, if a little contrived. But the most important of all is that the story is rated K+, FanficNet's 9 and up rating. Most of you are probably asking why this matters, but if you've read Parasect's fanfics before, then you should know he does not play when it comes to putting the Powerpuff Girls through as much hardship, horrific imagery, and trauma as possible, in basically every single one of his stories. Nothing Ventured/Trained is one of his tamer stories in this regard, since the girls come out of the whole experience moderately bruised but otherwise unscathed. But that doesn't mean there's no trauma to speak of. Oh no, no, no. A particularly gruesome scene involves Bubbles getting eaten alive by a bunch of alien monsters about halfway through the story. This just reminds me that for some reason, Bubbles always seems to get tortured the most out of the three in these stories, and this isn't the last time we'll be seeing that. If I only had one shot at pushing someone down the Parasect fanfic rabbit hole, this probably wouldn't be the story I'd go with. That'll come later on. But if you're someone trying to ease into the angsty dramas that a fair bit of his works fall under, Nothing Ventured, Nothing Trained is a decent first pick. It's a short and sweet fanfiction wrapped up in an enjoyable narrative, with just a little bit of edge to help you realize what you're in for from here on out. It even has a nice little comic by Ian Meta to go alongside it, which I've used for the B-roll in this video. I'll put a link down below to the comic. Just be warned that the comic is slightly less tame than its written counterpart, since not only do you actually get to see the injuries that the girls sustain throughout the story, but blood is prominently featured in the comic when it wasn't ever mentioned in the original fanfic. Mostly with the Bubbles injury that I talked about earlier. Damn, this just makes me feel even more sorry for her. My god. The next fanfiction we're going to be talking about is Phantasmal Truths. The best way I can describe this story is that it's basically what would happen if you took the basic premise of Paranoia from the original, cranked it up to 11, and forgot that you were writing for a children's cartoon in the process. Obviously, Parasect doesn't have to worry about the whole writing for a children's cartoon thing, but I've always found it interesting how similar this fic ended up being to Paranoia, when that episode wouldn't have been out for another year. Could this simple fanfiction really have inspired a Powerpuff Girls episode? I mean, I doubt it, but it's still a funny coincidence. As I've already alluded to, the meat of the narrative involves the Powerpuff Girls suffering from horrible dreams and illusions that play on their deepest fears. We start out with Buttercup waking up from a nightmare from which a monster nearly eats her alive, and the other two girls don't fare much better. But the girls remind themselves that at the end of the day, or night, there's really nothing to worry about because these are just dreams. Even if it's strangely convenient how all three girls had nightmares on the same night. Even if the girls get so freaked out that they don't sleep the rest of the night. And even if their lack of sleep causes them to hallucinate throughout the entire day. They don't have anything to worry about. After all, nobody really gets hurt in dreams. At least that's what the girls tell themselves in the beginning. As we progress through the story, these dreams become more and more frequent. The hallucinations get so bad that it makes them question their very sense of reality. And as for the dreams being harmless, well, why don't I just read this little excerpt from the story itself? Unfortunately, I don't have any comics that could be used as B-roll, but not to worry, I've got just the solution. In the silence of the hallway, Bubbles kept running. She didn't know what she was running from, but she knew she had to get away. She traveled down the long hallway, pausing for a moment to catch her breath. What's going on? She wondered. I must be dreaming again. Yes, this has to be a dream. She looked back down the hallway and saw them coming around the corner. There were a half dozen of them. They limped slowly forward, barely visible in the light, but she could still make them out. Their pale skin was ragged and torn, and some of their limbs were twisted at unnatural angles. Even their eyes looked glazed over, rolled back into their heads. The only sound from them besides the shuffling of their feet was their low, incoherent moaning. Zombies, she thought. Picking herself back up again, she ran further down the hallway. As she reached the end of it, she found it was a dead end. Glancing around nervously, she looked for some way out, but there was none. The zombies came gradually closer, their arms outstretched for her, and she backed up quickly and fearfully into the corner. It's only a dream. It has to be, Bubbles told herself. I'll wake up. I've got to wake up. The zombies surrounded her, and now there was nowhere left to run. She held up her hands protectively in front of her, but it did no good. They reached out and grabbed a hold of her. She could feel the clamminess of their skin and smell the horrible stench of their rotting flesh. It made her cringe, and she silently prayed. Please, let this be a dream. I gotta wake up. It's not real. I gotta wake up. She was momentarily surprised when she felt the claws of one of them digging into her arm. She felt pain from it. What? She thought. But it never hurts in dreams. And if I didn't wake up, what if I can't wake up? At that moment, one of the zombies brought its teeth into her arm. A sharp pain shot through her and she yelped in alarm. The pain actually got worse as the zombies pulled its teeth away, like it had taken something with it. Complete panic now seized Bubbles, as she realized that maybe this wasn't a dream after all. She thrashed about, trying to get free. We're just gonna pretend I said free there, because I don't want to retake that line. But she couldn't. The grip of the zombies were unbreakable. More of them began to bite into her, and it just kept getting worse by the second. She felt their teeth tugging at her. She felt the pain growing greater and greater, and began screaming her heart out. A flash of red shot past her eyes as a new pain seized her shoulder. She looked over, and through her tear-filled eyes, she saw her arm. But why did it look so far away? In horror, she realized why, and clenched her eyes shut so that she couldn't see it anymore. Her screams continued as the pain grew still worse, and in her mind she shrieked, Please let me wake up! Let this be a dream! Please! Oh God! Make them stop! Make them stop! Please God, make them stop! Did you guys like my reading? I don't know, I feel like I nailed that part, but let me know what you thought in the comments. But yeah, I'm just gonna add a counter for every time Bubbles goes through something exceptionally traumatic compared to Blossom and Buttercup, because like, if you actually read their nightmares in the chapter I'm referencing, they definitely were not great either, but they weren't nearly as bad as Bubbles' nightmare in my opinion. But anyway, there are a lot of different reasons why I really like Phantasmal Truths. For one thing, I've always had a soft spot for dream episodes. No, I don't mean episodes that turn out to be a dream right at the end. Those are just the modern day equivalent of flaking out on your friend's birthday party at the last minute just to go drinking at a bar with your fellow losers. But any episode that uses the dreaming landscape to explore its characters and world building without the limitations of canon or continuity often ends up being some of the most creative and introspective material its respective show has to offer. And Phantasmal Truths exemplifies this to a T. It has its fair share of horrifying imagery that we all expect from the nightmares the girls have, but there are some genuinely creative set pieces that really keep you on the edge of your seat while you watch them suffer through everything. That scene with Bubbles and the zombies genuinely did make me feel uneasy throughout it, which again, neither Blossom nor Buttercup scenes managed to do. And yet, there's also the occasional dream sequence that has something to say about the characters. The ones that aren't afraid to lay down a quick character study that bleeds into the real world and causes our heroes to reflect on their own faults. One of Blossom's nightmares early in the story involves her and the girls fighting a monster that can't be beaten no matter what they try. Blossom's efforts to find a plan for the monster's defeat continuously end up doing more harm than good, until eventually both of her sisters wind up dead by her orders. Another dream sequence that coincidentally also follows Blossom involves her heading to the mayor's office, only to be told that she's pretty much the cause of all of Townsville's problems. She descended and entered City Hall, landing in the mayor's office. He was seated at his desk, and Miss Bellum was standing next to him, as usual. Sorry, Mayor, it's just me for this one, Blossom told them. What's the problem? Looking up from his desk, the mayor said, The problem is the three of you, I'm afraid. The mayor nodded sadly and turned to Miss Bellum. Tell them. Well, you see, Blossom, Miss Bellum said with some reluctance. We appreciate everything that you've done for Townsville, but we've done some thinking, and really, if it weren't for you girls, nothing bad would have ever happened to us here.
The City of Townsville is in some serious trouble.
One thing I should probably mention is that the majority of Parasec's PBG stories were written before the movie came out. So every once in a while, you'll get some conflicting information. Like the professor's very incorrect recount on what the girls did on their first day of school in Altered Destiny, or Miss Bellum proudly proclaiming that Townsville would be better off without the Powerpuff Girls. Aside from that little continuity error though, another great aspect of Phantasmal Truths is the pacing and especially the atmosphere. I find the way the story flows through events to be really well done, and it helps make the story feel that much more engaging. This is also helped a lot by the story's atmosphere, which is a given considering it's psychological horror we're dealing with. But even on that front, there's a real sense of unease and tension that only grows the further we get through the story until the climax. At first, the nightmares just seem to be a low-stakes, one-and-done ordeal that'll give the girl some daytime drowsiness at worst. And there's even a fair bit of comedy in this setup that helps lure readers into a false sense of security. Once the second round of nightmares begin, you should realize that things aren't quite as they seem, especially with how much more vivid the hallucinations are afterwards. There's even one scene where Bubbles tries to explain to Miss Keene what's been happening to them, and Miss Keene ends up blaming herself for overwhelming the girls with classwork. Unable to live with the guilt of what she's done to the girls, well, I can't exactly say what she did, but you can probably fill in the blanks, can't you? Okay, the whole thing turned out to be a dream Bubbles had while sleeping in class, but that doesn't really matter when we're adding things to the trauma counter now, does it? It gets to a point where the girls can't fight crime anymore because the hallucinations make them a liability. And then after that, even the dream world refuses to show them any mercy, because now the girls are actually starting to feel pain in their nightmares. Especially Bubbles getting eaten alive by zombies, Jesus Christ. I don't care if it's cheating, I'm adding another one to the counter. I could keep going, but I've spoiled enough at this point, and I'd like to keep from spoiling any of the final act. Even so, I implore y'all to read this story if you haven't already. It's a top-notch psychological thriller with plenty of surprises to keep you on edge throughout your read. And even though I talked about a few of those surprises, there are still plenty in store that you'll just have to see for yourself. Up next, we've got What Once Was. Oh, and just a quick disclaimer, around here is where we start talking about some of the more graphic stories in Parasec's lineup. In fact, you could make an argument that this is the most graphic story he's ever written for the Powerpuff Girls. I'll be doing my best to keep things light and comedic in the video, but do proceed with caution if you plan to read these final two stories. The Powerpuff Girls and Professor Utonium are on their way home from a vacation, seemingly having learned nothing from the events of Speed Demon, which I am completely fine with. It's a fun episode, don't get me wrong, but girl, you do realize you can just bring the hotline with you if something happens during your vacation. You don't have to swear off vacations entirely. Anyway, since it starts to get dark, they decide to stay at a hotel for the night, currently titled Hotel Venanda. At first, everything seems to be fine, but unless you've been living under the biggest rock imaginable, you probably already know where this is going. Yep, the hotel's haunted, with ghosts, supernatural occurrences, and everything in between. Who would have thought? My main problems with the story, if any, are definitely the tired usage of tropes and cliches. I've already mentioned the overused haunted building trope, but there's also a plot point where the Powerpuff Girls, aka the superheroes in this story, end up getting their powers taken away, presumably by the ghosts that inhabit the building. Taking away the powers of a heroine to keep the plot from wrapping up in 5 minutes is often done in fanfictions that feature a more mundane conflict, because it's an easy way of raising the stakes instead of inventing situations where the heroes would struggle even with their powers. Phantasmal Truths managed to be a high-stakes thriller despite the girls being superheroes, and I get that the same idea would be harder to work with in a setting like this, but I would have loved to see some creative workarounds that keep the high stakes despite the powers still being available. Both of these issues can wind up making the story feel a bit generic at times, because it mostly involves the characters just reacting to things around them, when they could be taking a more proactive role with a more creative setup. If you can get past those setbacks, however, this fanfic has a surprisingly large number of things to offer despite its deceptively simple premise. And what it lacks in concept, it makes up for in execution. Starting with the ghosts themselves, they do a lot of heavy lifting throughout the narrative thanks to their more vibrant personalities compared to your average horror flick. It's explained that the ghosts like to play these characters, which are really just all the people who have resided in the building throughout its inception, since it has a very extensive history that dates back centuries ago, being renovated many times over the years. A lot of the ghosts are genuinely entertaining to read about, and a lot of them are straight up horrifying, but what can you expect from a story like this, right? The point is, you can find plenty of examples of both. Like that one scene where Bubbles stumbles across a room full of monks that ask her to help Sister Mary repent her sins. They do that by torturing her, by the way. Then, when Bubbles refuses, they try to kill her too. Ooh, how about that other scene where Bubbles gets possessed by one of the ghosts? And how about that other scene where a wolf ghost just comes out of nowhere? And of course, Bubbles is the one who gets chased by it the most. You know, let's read the excerpt for that as well. Okay, Bubbles said, calming down. Okay, well, where to? I think we should head, Blossom started to say, but then was cut off by a loud, animalistic growl in one direction of the hall. Turning to look, both of them saw something rounding the end of the hallway, coming into the light. It was a large, black-furried wolf, trotting along slowly but baring its teeth angrily at the two of them. Blossom finished her sentence, "This way," and pulled Bubbles with her as she ran the other direction down the hall. The wolf immediately started charging after them. The girls ran for their lives, at least they had a long lead on it. When they reached the end of the corridor, it split up in two separate directions. Reaching it at the same time, both of them started running in opposite directions. Blossom hesitated for a moment, realizing that they had inadvertently split up, and was about to run down Bubbles' direction when she realized that she didn't have time. The wolf would be upon them any moment. She resumed sprinting down her own hallway. Bubbles noticed that Blossom had gone the other way, and as she ran halfway down her own side of the hall, she looked over her shoulder at the intersection they had just come from. The wolf came into view, stopping and sniffing the air down each passage, then turned towards Bubbles and started running after her. With a shriek, Bubbles redoubled her efforts, running as fast as she possibly could. She rounded the bend in the hallway and noticed an open door not far down that read H. Fenton on it. Darting to the door, she rushed inside. It looked like an office, and had several chairs and pieces of furniture, and a tile floor instead of carpet. Without a moment's hesitation, she circled around the desk and quickly wedged herself underneath it. She clamped her hands over her mouth to stifle her own cries, but she wasn't completely without sound. She was breathing heavily, both from her sprint and in fear. She waited and listened. Eventually, she heard the sound of something sniffing the air, and the pads of feet trotting by the door to the room. The foot sounds came to a halt, and Bubbles clenched her eyes shut, trying to stay as quiet as she could. Although she was trembling with fright, thinking, "Don't come in here. Please don't find me. Go away. Please go away." The sound of the wolf's feet started up again, and she heard the claws clacking against the tiles of the office door. Bubbles sweated and kept her hands clasped over her mouth. It was all she could do to keep from making any sound, and she prayed the wolf wouldn't find her. She heard the wolf sniffing the air. It grew louder, and Bubbles held her breath as she saw the tip of the wolf's muzzle come into view at the edge of the desk's opening, still sniffing. "Oh my god. Oh my god," Bubbles thought, tensing up and preparing to run if she was discovered. The wolf sniffed a few more times. Then Bubbles heard a low growl erupt from his throat. That was the sign. She knew she had been found. With a cry, she leapt out from behind the desk, scrambling for a moment as she tried to go around the other side to make a break for the door. The wolf charged, butting into her head first. She tripped and landed on the ground, skidding a foot or so before coming to a stop next to a tall floor lamp. The wolf rounded the edge of the desk, and Bubbles frantically grabbed hold of the floor lamp, pulling it over to try and block him off. As she held onto the bar from the lamp, the wolf lunged with its teeth, clamping onto the lamp instead. Bubbles screamed as the wolf tried to wrench it away, and held on for dear life. "Help!" she shrieked. "Somebody help!" With a mighty shake of its jaws, the wolf flung the lamp aside, but since Bubbles was still hanging onto it, she was tossed through the air like a rag doll, through the open door of the office. She landed on her stomach, the wind knocked out of her from the fall. As she gasped for air and tried to get back up, a clawed foot slammed down on the back of her neck, pressing her against the ground again. She tried to scream again, but couldn't, as the wolf opened its jaws and reached down towards her back. Look, I get that we're focusing on Bubbles a lot here, but I'm just really trying to make you see how much the author loves to torture her specifically. And on that note... But seriously though, there's more to me narrating this than just adding more trauma to the Bubbles counter. The strategic use of gore and just how brutal it is actually another reason for this story being so fun to read. It's like a car crash. You want to look away, but you just can't. You see these characters gradually become more and more injured from the ghosts, just desperate to find a way out of the hell they've been locked in. And you just want to look away, but you just need to know how they make it out alive. It's actually kind of ironic. I think a lot of edgy stories, especially in the My Little Pony fandom, tend to use gore in a very excessive and juvenile way that screams, "This is what the fic was written for, now be disturbed." But Pearsec demonstrates in all his stories, but especially this one, that excessive gore on its own can be extremely effective in adding to the tension and engagement of your story. And honestly, for all my jokes about the violence Bubbles goes through, she arguably sustains the least gruesome injuries in this one. Buttercup gets her leg cut off from ghosts who are playing the part of hospital workers tending to a military soldier from the Civil War, and the professor gets his leg twisted and broken by a random ghost underground with very little provocation. Throughout the story, the Utoniums are pretty much at the mercy of figures that can do whatever they want to them without consequence. And again, that's to be expected in a plot like this, but it's the stilted sense of progression, the staggering fear of the unknown, the knowledge of absolute terror and chaos just being one unopened door away. All of this just makes this story such a wild ride to get through. I don't know how the man does it. He's a magician, I tell you. Unfortunately, the ending is a bit of a letdown, mostly because it involves the use of a trope that I do not enjoy most of the time. If you are paying attention, you know what that is. But I can overlook that to an extent because it admittedly is really funny and captures the comedic wit and charm of the original show very well. It's definitely something I could see a classic episode ending on, though probably with a less gruesome plotline to go with it. Overall, What Once Was isn't the most original story around by a long shot. But, like with any magician, it's not the rabbit that makes the hat interesting, but the masterful illusion behind it. Pearsec was able to get an insane amount of mileage out of an extremely predictable premise. And for that, I have to give credit where it's due. I'm honestly surprised at how much I enjoyed this story, even after all the times I've reread it over the years. With such a wild ride like this, what exactly could Pearsec do to top it? Well, I'll tell you what that is. Last but certainly not least, we're going to be talking about Immortality Syndrome. Remember when I said Nothing Ventured, Nothing Trained wouldn't be the first story I'd recommend to get into the Pearsec Powerpuff rabbit hole? That's because this is the story. It's this one, right here. We'll be talking about this story very briefly, partly because this is a story I genuinely want to spoil as little of as possible so you can truly get the full experience on a first read, and partly because it's probably the most well-known story from Pearsec's lineup and you may already be familiar with it. And also because I'm probably going to do a video solely on this story and its two sequels later down the line. Yep, there were 2 sequels made for this story, and they're both awesome. Mostly. We'll have time to talk about it later. The story begins with the Powerpuff Girls enjoying some time off by tending to their hobbies, when all of a sudden, Mojo drops by to pay them a visit. Unlike most other times the girls fight the monkey, however, he appears to have an ace up his sleeve, that being Duranium saw blades. For those who don't know, Duranium is an extremely strong substance that I believe originated from Star Trek. Pearsec uses the substance in several of his stories since it's said to be able to contain a Powerpuff despite their massive strength and even pierce through their skin. Mojo takes advantage of the new material in the fight, eventually managing to capture Blossom and saw her in half. Bubbles and Buttercup quickly manage to regain the upper hand and defeat Mojo after this, but it doesn't change the fact that he successfully killed one of their own. And it isn't long before Blossom breaks down into her base ingredients of sugar, spice, and everything nice. That is, until the professor gets an idea. He rushes to his lab to mix Blossom's ingredients back together and add in the chemical X, essentially recreating her, and by extension, inadvertently giving the girls the power of immortality. Naturally, the girls and the professor are overjoyed to have Blossom back with them, but the price of immortality becomes apparent in ways none of them could have expected very soon. And that's it. That's all you're getting from me. That brief synopsis is all just information from barely even halfway through the first chapter, and there are 4 chapters in total, so you'll have to read it to find out what happens next. I would say you can also read the comic adaptation since there was one made for it, but I have very mixed feelings on it. At the end of the day, it's alright, it's nothing terrible, but it ultimately feels a little too juvenile, for lack of a better word. What I'm trying to say is that it doesn't do a good job of capturing the tone of the actual story and winds up feeling more like an episode from the original show, when that sort of vibe is just out of place in a story like this. It's a fine read on its own, but it doesn't really do the story justice in my opinion. Aside from the comic, all I'm gonna say about Immortality Syndrome right now is that it's a popular story for a reason. It has all the best aspects of the last 3 stories I've talked about, and then some. I cannot encourage you guys to read this story enough. Just do it. And then read Immortality Relapse and Solitary Vigil, because otherwise you'll have to wait until I get around to making a video on these. Which could take a while, TBH. I'm a busy man, y'all. College is starting up for me in like a week at the time of me writing this script and recording this audio. Things will be ready when they're ready. So yeah, that was a small little peek into the large, gruesome, and very traumatic world of Pairsex Powerpuff Girls fanfiction. Maybe someday we'll come back and look at a few more of them. And maybe even some stories from other creators too. Wink wink. But for now... Okay, real talk, I didn't actually finish the conclusion part of my script for this video, but don't judge me. Like I said, I'm a busy college man. But anyway, subscribe if you want to see more videos from me. I do a lot of stuff, Powerpuff Girls, Winx Club, Sonic, and click the little bell so you know when I upload. Leave a comment down below and let me know what you think of the Pairsex Powerpuff fanfic verse. What is your experience with reading his traumatic stories? I would love to know, honestly. But other than that, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, night, whenever you're watching this, and I'll see you in the next one.